Okay, welcome to Lecture 7 in IT Leadership and Management, continuing with our Structure and Operations unit. Today's topic is going to be controlling through governance and values, and a bit about disruptive innovation, disruptive in general, and politics. Here's the agenda for today, and this has already happened since this is a day or two after we took the tour to the MCAA data center, and also heard from a guest interview from Molly Chang. And so this is a placeholder for Molly. Her video, the interview we had with her with our question and answers has been posted on the class YouTube channel. So if you don't have the link for that, it is in the notes section of the slides and is also on a prior announcement in Canvas. So I won't go through her background again because that's in the interview video, which is separate. And then, of course, we took the tour of the Michigan Academic Computing Center, which was an amazing 10,000 square foot data center, very much state-of-the-art Tier 2 data center. And Eric Lakin, who he and Brian did an overview presentation. That slide deck has been posted on Canvas, in Canvas and presentation slides. And Hoo-Jun was kind enough to take some great photos of the tour, and the link for those is in the notes section of this slide. So let's continue with the video lecture. And this slide we've looked at each week and just shows where we are in the structure of the class. We're on controlling governance through governance, and understanding politics is the shorter title. And the question for today is, so how are we going to balance innovation and metrics? And so we'll have a sort of a part 2 on metrics that we looked at a prior lecture. And then good governance and politics, which often derail good governance. This builds on lecture 5 in terms of governing and controlling IT while innovating. One of the paradoxes that Martha Heller pointed out in her book, The CIO Paradox, which we noted last week. And also builds from lecture 6 on how do we balance process and speed and quality and efficiency for managing projects, and a concept that we've been studying in the Phoenix project on flow. Okay, so why does an IT manager need to know this? Well, we could retitle this lecture, so what to do when things go wrong or get challenged. And there are 4 takeaways from it that so this is, if you will, is a bit of a 4x4 on the class itself. That governance distributes the ownership of IT, that we're all in this together. Disruptive innovations are most often digital, and we need to continually embrace that paradox of the new and the old in IT management. Reports are an IT communications and a marketing tool of what's going right and what's going wrong, and what is being improved. There is no organization without politics. Key lesson for the add-on reading we had from Tom DeMarco from his book called The Deadline on the Sinister Minister Belloc. That's a bit of a tongue twister. We'll come back to that. And we need to appeal to values and to the and. So, governance revisited. Wheel and Ross at MIT developed this framework. We briefly introduced it in a prior lecture, but this shows how, in fact, this is built out for UPS, the logistics company, delivery company. That's if you order anything from Amazon, you often get it through UPS, although more and more that's coming through Amazon's own distribution network of vans. But the notion is that the IT principles, that's a business monarchy. In other words, the business side owns that. IT architecture, though, the IT department owns that, so it's an IT monarchy. The IT infrastructure strategies, that's again also owned by IT. That's more toward the bottom of the stack, or actually most of the stack we looked at in the last class is in the IT management domain. Business application domain, that's that's federal, so that's shared by both IT and the business side. And then IT investment is owned by the business side. So you can see the responsibilities of governance in a chart like this. Another way to look at this is that the x-axis is the what, and this y-axis on the left is more of the how. And we talked about this in relationship to project prioritization. And now this is looking at the entire enterprise. So this is IT governance from that broader lens of the organization. And so if in this one we talk about, who owns what particular area, we drill down further, and here's how we broke it down among different groups at the International Red Cross, which is IFRC where I worked. And we use what was called a RASCI diagram. Sometimes you may have seen these called RACI diagrams. That's an acronym for who's responsible, who approves, who consults, who's consulted rather, and who's informed, and then the S is sometimes added in who supports this. And so some of these roles are shared, as you noticed, through the organization. So the senior management team is certainly informed across the way, but they're consulted on the business application needs. And then they are also have an approval role on certainly the IT investment. There can be multiple responsible groups for executing these things, but there can only be one owner, one A, who actually is the approval and particularly approving the spending and the people resources that are done. This is useful when setting up a project, for example, to say, okay, what roles do the stakeholders play on this? And an important thing to note is that those that are consulted their input is gathered at the beginning. They don't participate in the decision. And the informed are people who are informed after, and they also don't participate in the decision. But the decision process is one involving the responsible and the approvers, but the decision-making and responsibility resides with the approver. So as I said, you can do this for projects, you can do this for departments, which is what this case is, and you can do it for broader organizations. So notice there are business monarchies in these two areas, which we saw in the previous slide, and then there are IT monarchies and these others that also tie to the Weil and Ross chart on the previous slide. So with RACI diagrams and decision making, which I've already said, those that give input at the beginning of the process are those that are consulted. The decision making in the middle is the accountable, responsible, and then the output is those who get informed. So there is communication at each step of the decision process, but it's different depending on what the role of the individuals are. And the important thing here of clarifying this is to say that, those that are consulted are not participating in the decision, and that's oftentimes an important boundary to make clear. The same with those that are informed. We'll keep you in the loop and inform you what we're doing, but these are our decisions to make, or another group's decisions to make. And then again, those are the ones that will participate in the decision making. So when we look back at Gartner's proposal that we have two modes to IT, that is to manage two different ways of delivering IT. One that's focused on stability, more of the legacy systems, where you have to have dependable systems. For example, that data center tour, that data center itself is part of the stability, a part of an IT operation. And the other is agility. How can we change quickly, take advantage of new technologies, and also have experiments that we're running. Mode one tends to be more traditional, it's more sequential, and that emphasis is on reducing risk or safety and one of accuracy. And mode two Agility and speed are key characteristics, which means that there will be failures in mode 2, and then learning from those experiments and adjusting, and those things that succeed may in fact over time become mode 1 types of IT. It's important to do both because if you just focus as an IT manager on mode 1, you'll be accused of not keeping current with innovations and opportunities, particularly if competitors or other organizations are running ahead with those. The CEO and senior management team will come back and say, we're falling behind. Where are we doing innovative things? On the other hand, if you do have all your focus and budget on the innovative, you probably are not going to have a very stable organization. And so the IT manager has to do both of these things. It also may be two different teams on IT, and that may be difficult because everybody wants to work on innovation, but also there's value in keeping things running smoothly. And I think, hearing from Eric and Brian this week, their job is to keep things running smoothly. And so the separation of teams and what the emphasis is on each of those teams becomes rather important. We'll come back to this when we talk about staffing and people in the third unit for the class. So another way to look at this is that, the bimodal IT, you've got marathon runners and you've got sprinters, to use a running analogy. And the marathon runner, has these characteristics when translated to IT in mode 1. And in mode 2, it's the sprinter. Actually, it's no coincidence that sprint is a characteristic of agile development methodology. And you particularly look at these cycle times at the bottom between long and short, and some of these others that are on the list as well. It's just some footnotes on some of the acronyms at the bottom that you can refer to. So this is a Gartner chart that I found particularly useful. All right, let's shift to disruptive innovation. So I love this cartoon. I've had this in a number of writings that I've done because it really illustrates the problem that even if you're on the right track and everything is running smoothly and you're just focusing on mode 1, you'll get run over if you just sit there. So you have to be aware of change and disruption in addition to keeping things dependable. So again, the two modes come to the fore. I'll let you watch this video at your leisure. It's an interview with Clay Christensen on disruptive innovation, and he describes the process of how that works. And then, so I'll pause here and ask you to pause the video, go watch this video on YouTube at the link, and then come back. Okay, we're back. So disruptive innovation, graphically represented, has got these characteristics between time and performance, and essentially it creates a new market that it starts off being rather low quality. And a good example is when the mobile phone sector began. Mobile phone connections were often spotty, depending on where cell towers were. And AT&T, the incumbent giant, essentially said, there's no way that their mobile phones are ever going to match the quality of what we call our twisted pair networks or copper wire networks. And the definition for quality at AT&T was beyond that which could be provided by mobile phones. However, over time, mobile phones began to gain in performance. They also dropped in cost and dropped in size to the point where AT&T was getting left behind. The situation, I think, probably over the last decade is that most people will have a mobile phone. at home and not have a landline phone, even if it's through the cable provider. And so the disruption happens because this sort of low quality, very agile type technology comes along, and the incumbents then can't change fast enough. So what AT&T had to do was actually buy Macaw Mobile in order to catch up by acquiring it. A number of industries have been left behind by disruptive innovation. This is a wonderful ad that was run by I think it was Motley Fool. You can look at the link in the notes section of the slide. Some of these things you may not even recognize. The fact that music was played on vinyl records on that third one on the top, and what in the world is that item that's in the lower left-hand corner? You may have seen that at your grandmother's house. Is a telephone, calculators. Who has seen those? And their use in the brokerage industry, newspapers. Everybody on the train commuting into New York, when I worked downtown New York, was always reading either the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and sometimes both. And nowadays you may see a couple of papers here and there, but most people are reading those news stories on their phones or on their laptops. So these are industries which were dominant in their sectors and then have been replaced by newer technologies. Cable TV's been totally disrupted by streaming video, which only became possible as the bandwidth increased enough to support streaming video, and the costs came down as better deals were done with the movie providers. There's a great page, a table that's kept on Wikipedia. So if you look at disruptive innovations, look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see a number of categories here down the left. And what innovation came along, and then what did it disrupt in the last column. And you'll notice, Wikipedia itself is disrupting traditional encyclopedias. Smartphones didn't disrupt landline phones as much as they disrupted personal computers and laptops and what were called personal digital assistants at the time. Streaming video, I already mentioned that not only disrupted the movie industry, it disrupted video rentals. Companies went out of business who used to rent both first VHS tape and then DVD discs. Hardly anybody does that anymore. And then on transportation, high-speed rail, disrupting short-term flights as some of those became more available and actually easier to navigate. And the Acela train in the Northeast corridor of the US is a good example. More so in Europe. I think there are more bullet trains in Europe and in Asia that are often preferred ways of traveling for speed and for cost. Christensen defines, three different types of innovation. There's he calls the disruptive innovation, he calls empowering innovation, because it takes complicated and costly products and makes it available to the many. So it takes it to mass market. And it often creates new markets too, which just wreaks havoc in industries. The example he cites is the Ford Motor Company Model T car. Probably not only that disrupted the specialty cars that were first coming on the market, but also disrupted the horse and buggy in a big way. Sustaining innovations, so that replaces old models with new ones that have new technology. They may have new features, more powerful, etc. The Toyota Prius is an example of probably being an innovation that became an upgrade to the Camry, the family car. And then efficiency innovations is how do you make an existing product more proficiently, like the lean production in the Phoenix case, for example. The fascinating thing is that Clay Christensen said that, well, it's only disruptive innovations, only that first one that really creates new jobs. The sustaining innovations in number two may keep, keep the same number of jobs. And the efficiency innovation at the bottom is going to remove jobs. Now, one could argue that disruptive innovation is also going to, insofar as it puts companies out of business, is going to lose jobs. But in creating new markets, it's creating positions. It also means that an efficiency innovation brings what I call that false comfort of incrementalism. So that organizations that say, oh yes, we're innovative, we're making our existing processes and our existing products much more efficient, that's usually incremental improvements and doesn't protect you well for very long against disruption. May buy you some time, certainly will buy you some cost savings, but is not going to ultimately keep you in the game. We also, as part of a task force at the International Civil Society Center, that's out of Berlin, and we did a study on disruptive change in nonprofit organizations. And we did a little survey in the room when we got about 40, 50 CEOs of large nonprofit organizations, international nonprofits. And we asked the question, is disruptive innovation a clear and present threat to your organizations? And everyone raised their hand. And so nobody saw or doubted the relevance of disruptive innovation. And that was in 2013. So it was recognized, relatively speaking, at an early date by nonprofit organizations. Questionable whether, in fact, they've done much about it. And in the modern, current day digital transformation, we're probably seeing more of that. You can watch the video that we produced as part of this study at the link at the bottom. Excuse me. One of the conclusions that we had from this study was that scale and speed and surprise is what equals disruption. And that also change itself has been altered. It's been getting faster, more fundamental in terms of its impact on organizations, and more surprising. And when you have these three elements together, then that makes for disruption, and that's how we defined it in the nonprofit space. The American Red Cross took this very seriously and took a look at a number of, actually 8 different emerging technologies in a study that they did in 2015. It involved going and meeting with a dozen different communities on 6 different continents and asking the question about whether the opportunities presented by these emerging technologies could in fact have positive impact on their communities. From that, 4 were identified as having potential impact and requiring more investigation and experimentation, at least in the American Red Cross. Biometric scanners, which we've seen certainly used in refugee situations more strongly. Smart home sensor networks. I think that's still yet to be seen. Certainly UAVs or drones have been used more and more in disaster response and even delivering remote medical supplies. And then wearable devices is another thing that I don't think has taken off yet, but that was viewed as another possibility. Think of it as a sort of Fitbits for the humanitarian space. Okay, so when assessing digital disruption, you need to consider the one fact here. This is the CEO of Accenture who said this in 2016, is that these new digital business models are the key reason why over half of the Fortune 500 have disappeared since the year 2000. I found that rather staggering. So the Fortune 500 are the largest organizations in the world, corporations, and half of them disappeared since the year 2000, largely due to digital disruption. So it has tremendous impact. And one of the questions we asked on the nonprofit side is, do we think we're immune from that? Would that be the ultimate expression of hubris? So the other problem is that organizations are slow to recognize that disruption is a problem. So this statistic from Capgemini I found particularly staggering, that 74% of companies responded to digital disruptions only after the second year of their occurrence. So it's almost, you have to go through a period of denial before then you have to play hurry up in order to respond to those disruptions. And in some cases, that's too late. Kodak may be a good example of that. One of the ways we looked at having a continuous funnel or flow of innovation at the International Red Cross is that we recognize that there are many small pilot projects that are done across the organization in many of the field offices, for example. And then we wanted to take what we call the discover and harvest approach to how can we look for what 5 of those 20 we can scale up and maybe make these are the investment numbers in parentheses. So we may spend 20,000 each on the pilots, but when we scale up, we'll spend 100,000, and then 2 of those may go mainstream, and we would budget 300,000 for those. And so over a horizon of what we viewed as 36 months was how can we harvest more of these discoveries from the field and bring them on to mainstream. One good example of that is Skype. Skype was something that was used extensively in the field organizations because field workers, particularly those that were on temporary duty assignments, could keep in touch with their families back in their home country more readily. And then also important, they could keep in touch with sub-grantees, those who worked for other organizations on the country programs, and were on different systems, but everybody could talk and send messages on Skype. So it was adopted first in the field. We ended up harvesting that and making it part of our mainstream laptop upgrades within a year of that. And here the message is, well, there are also internal disruptions. If you look for where those are occurring in your organization, and the larger the organization and the more international and with many locations the organization has, the more likely it is that somebody's already solved 80% of your problem. Okay, let's shift now to metrics and our second half unit on governance, also on metrics as well. Going back to Martha Heller and our CIO paradox, there are 2 paradoxes that we looked at the first one last week. You are hired to be strategic, but you're forced to spend more of your time on operational issues. And then here you are the steward of risk mitigation. So these are the things that are done to alleviate or correct risks and cost containment, yet you're expected to innovate. And of course, innovation has a higher incident of failure, and you have to have a greater tolerance and acceptance of failure in order to get a large amounts of innovation. That, by the way, is something that's hard for students to learn because we view failure as an unacceptable setback, particularly when you're talking about grades and classes. But the way you get innovation when you're working on projects in your jobs and internships is you got to be experimenting. And if you're not experimenting, you can't innovate. And if you're experimenting, you're going to have failures. The famous story of Thomas Edison in developing the light bulb, he is famously known to have had 10,000 experiments in the Menlo Park lab before they figured out what combination of filament and ingredients and a vacuum seal in the bulb produced the greatest amount of light. And someone once said to him, how do you deal with the fact that you had 10,000 failures? And he said, I don't have 10,000 failures. He said, I have 10,000 ways I discovered that light bulbs don't work. What an interesting way to reframe the problem. And then the paradox continued. Your function seen as a service provider, but you're expected to be a business driver. IT can make or break a company, but the CIOs are rarely on the corporate board. And your many successes are invisible, but your few mistakes are highly visible. We used to call this the deodorant theory of IT operations. Again, Martha Heller writes in her books from hundreds of interviews she does with CIOs, and so she has taken and discovered the themes in the conversations that she's had with CIOs, which is a valuable perspective. And of course, that's the curse of operations, is that you make a few mistakes. You remember Kevin talked about during the data center tour, talked about the one outage they had in November 23rd that they're still talking about. And they're still recovering from in terms of changing and updating policies and procedures. Very visible, and yet that's the only mistake that he said that from the last 10 years that they were able to identify. I've introduced this before in terms of the IT annual report we did at the IFRC. This is the marketing side of the of metrics. We actually had a CIO summit each year where we brought in the heads of IT from 100 different country organizations, which are independent organizations within the Red Cross Red Crescent Federation. And then we printed this report that had key metrics and provided an online copy of this as well. To get this online copy at this link, though, you need to register with the IFRC, which I think they still grant registration and access for free. You can give it a try. If you want to see the report, come and see me. I have each of the year's copies in my office. And so this was not only communicating the key metrics that we used to determining where we were succeeding and failing, but it also communicated our vision of where we were going. So it talked about IT strategy in the beginning. It talked about where we were going next in terms of how we were building on the successes of the current year. And so it became a key document for the organization. It was also sent out to, as I said, at the CIO Summit, to all of the IT leaders in the Federation. And then it was shared outside with other nonprofit organizations as well. The contents in this annual report, so these are the strategic things I mentioned at the beginning. The second one was our connection to the organization, business strategy. That was what Strategy 2020 was. We had the infrastructure side in terms of our IT environment, what progress we'd made on the IT strategy, our scorecard with the metrics, etc. The key thing that we listed here were benefits for stakeholders in number 8 here on this list. And then the forward-looking, what's our outlook for the next 5 years and what's coming up next in the next year for our IT strategy. And the key inspiration for this was the annual report that Kim Stevenson did at Intel while she was CIO, and her successor now does. One of those reports was on our reading list. Notice that the benefits for stakeholders is also another example of the WIFM principle, right? Telling people what's in it for me. And in this case, what's in it for them, but answering the what's in it for me question for them. We also, in the metrics part of this, we arrange things in 12 questions and 12 charts. And the questions were designed to be questions that would more likely matter to end users and our department heads and various groups throughout the organization. Like are more beneficiaries being reached, which is a particular interest to our program development people. Our new technologies getting delivered is, the innovation part in number 6. One of our key stakeholders, or the key stakeholders, were national societies. Were they getting stronger? And we even measured the greenness of IT and whether IT was getting greener as well. And again, yeah, that key intersection with new technologies and innovation. The heat map I've shown you before, we've looked at, so at a glance, you could tell on these 12 questions where we were having some challenges, where we were having some successes in greens. And then a further drill down was on the actual word that we put in those boxes and explained that with a comment to the right. And we call this a heat map because the more negative things are hotter, namely red, and it's always good to have cool green things as well. We took 4 of our metrics and arrange them in what is called a typical balanced scorecard, where we have some internal measures on the top row here, the top two, and then external measures on the bottom two, more tactical measures on the left, and more strategic on the right. And a balanced scorecard, is essentially saying that, a good IT department is attempting to keep each of these in balance and a relationship to the other. The number of societies crossing the digital divide in that bottom right-hand side was one of our key strategic objectives. Okay, we'll leave metrics now and talk about a fun and interesting topic on politics. I hope you enjoyed the readings for this week. Although I should say that in the Phoenix book, we've been seeing lots of politics operating even from the beginning of the book. And unfortunately, this is all too common in organizations, and something that you will probably encounter again and again. And we've read about, Michael Lopez talked about sort of the knee-jerk reactions that people might have on various teams. The other author that we looked at talks about, types of office politicians. It's always good to come up with these fun names for these, from the gossip hound, to the latecomer, and big ego and advisor in the saboteur, probably one of the ones to be avoided. But an interesting question is, if you look again at the characters in Phoenix, which one of these was Belloc, or was he actually multiple? I'm pausing there for you to think about that, but a case could be made for him being both the big ego and the bully, and maybe a bit of the climber as well. I think he fancied himself being the next CEO. One of the things that comes out of the Deadline story about Belloc and this project team that's run under Tompkins is the response to the pathological politics. And one of the key things at the end of each chapter in the book, The Deadline, there's Tompkins' journal, and he sort of summarizes some key points. You can actually get a lot out of that book just by flipping through and reading the journal entries, although it's a fun story anyway, and I would recommend it. If you like the Phoenix Project, you'll like The Deadline. And a key characteristic is that, this is the personal power and influence are more viewed as more important by individuals than the goals of the organization. So when you put individuals, and namely when you put me above the organization, then I am more likely to be a pathological politics type person. And then the ex-general in the story, in the Deadline story, has this wonderful statement here saying, well, this may not be about an either-or decision. It may be a matter of that we can do both things. We can do what the Belloc is demanding of them, and also continue to run the projects and experiments that they want to do on their own. And you may view that as a dishonest, or certainly non-transparent, but sometimes you have to make compromises that don't compromise your values, and that's where the group finally ends up, and why they reach the decision to do what they want to do. And the key conclusion is that power of the and is greater than the power of the or. When you're faced with politics and conflicts of an organization, it's therefore useful to have a discussion, at least with yourself, if not some others, about, well, what's the and here that we could do, as opposed to the either or, where we set it up as somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. How do we both win? Maybe we win a little bit less than the whole, but it's not a matter of I win, you lose type of choices. Another key balance for politics and also in governance is values, and shared values in particular in an organization. So GE had some corporate values that were outlined in their annual report in 2000. Jack Welch indicated that these 5 values were important, and he also introduced the boundaryless organization in number 2. Integrity and trust are in here, and change is got to be embraced as the growth opportunity. You can read the full letter that he wrote to shareholders in that annual report letter at the link that's at the bottom here, and I hold it up to all of you to take a look at that. In that letter, Welch and subsequent writings that Welch did, he talked about 4 types of managers. And in this 2x2 matrix, so some of the business school type summary, where we've got delivering results on the left and sharing values on the right, and you have this type 1 manager in the upper right, so delivers a lot of results and highly shares the values of the organization. The message there is onward and upward. That person's on a strong career path forward. And then you've got those that share the values but have low delivery. There you give them a second chance, you coach them, you provide some training, and then you retry. Those that deliver low results and have low shared values with the organization, move them out. And then those on the type 4 that have high results but low values, they're the hardest. And Welch said you've got to move those out of the organization and make an example of it, because sharing of the values is actually, in this case, what he's saying is it's more fundamental than the results, and it's key to the results. Or having results that are value-based is what Welch and GE are saying they're going to do. And the real acid test is, can you deal with those type 4s as a manager? In NetHope, when we founded the organization, we started off with 5 key values. These are the ones that are in black, and then a few years into the work of NetHope, we realized that trust had a very important role to play, and we added trust to the list. Essentially, these values were, when I was the chairman of the board over a 10-year period of these, we would review these at the annual summit with all of the members and guests. And these didn't change. These were things that we reminded ourselves of at every juncture. That was core to what we did, regardless of how the technologies changed, regardless of how the projects changed, certainly regardless of how the disaster response changed over time. These values stayed constant for NetHope and were what we were about. The same types of thing exists in the International Red Cross, although for a much longer period of time. For now, 100 years, the 7 fundamental principles of the movement, which we've touched on in a prior class, particularly for universality, which we saw as a key connection point for IT. But humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, and unity. And you can read about them on the link that's in the notes section of the slide if you want to drill down further into these principles. But in universality, the principle says that, well, all those in the movement, so the societies, which are the country, individual country members, like in the UN system, they have equal status and share equal responsibilities and duties in helping each other, and that's got to be worldwide. And then, therefore, when we looked at the digital divide in the organization, where it was clear that we had some countries that were the haves and some that were the have-nots were in terms of IT connectivity, we said we've got to fix that. We've got to bridge that digital divide, and that's a matter of upholding this principle of universality. So looking at each of the principles in the Red Cross, we then developed and mapped an initiative that we had on the IT side. The UN also has similar things. So UNICEF actually began the UN Principles for Digital Development. And for those of you that are involved in UX work and HCI, you'll find these interesting. There's actually a Principles for Humanitarian Development website that you can go to now. Both of these are in the notes section of the slide. Designing with the users, understanding the existing ecosystem, design for scale, build for sustainability. Some of these you cover in your design classes, others may be context specific to the country in which we're working. And for international organizations, then that becomes important. Is that organization going to be able to, is that country or that organization in that country going to be able to sustain whatever we build digitally? And be able to run it themselves rather than depending on the large organizations to provide and continue to run those things. And the existing ecosystem. So the question I ask is, what's the tech footprint of that particular country? Is it one that is a sometimes connected 2G feature phone world? Or is it one that's got more broadband connectivity with laptops or smartphones that has a greater amounts of both voice and data capabilities available? That makes a difference in how you design your technology. Designing with the user and having user-centered design sessions where it's clear that they own the technology and the design, and that we are accompanying them on their journey through that. And this is a key reason why hackathons fail. Hackathons take usually an oversimplified need statement, work on it for 24 or 48 hours, and then that's it, they're done. I don't know that it's ever delivered any value as a result, and the key reason is there's no user involved in those in the hackathon sessions. And the tech footprint I've already mentioned. Then the next set of 5 principles being data-driven, using open standards, reuse and improve, privacy and security, particularly important with vulnerable populations, and then being collaborative and sharing results among the community. In a nonprofit, that's becomes something that's possible to do, and then becomes an imperative or a must-do. It's harder to be collaborative in for-profit organizations, although standard-setting organizations and standard-setting initiatives are examples of collaboration among even competing organizations. The reuse and improve is the important principle there is that, good IT management is about building on others' work. That's a principle of good engineering is standing on others' shoulders. Not reinventing the wheel, not starting from scratch every single time, but looking on how you can find what's available and build on top of it. And sharing, something we do naturally. Adrian found an interesting video. It's in the notes section. You can play and listen to this. But that politics and values are part of an overall system ecosystem. So when you're mapping out and understanding a systems project in an organization, it touches a variety of departments, it touches a variety of databases and organizations, and then people within those organizations and roles that they play as well. As you have a broader scope and look at design, the complexity increases. So what's the conclusion for today? Well, good governance makes for smooth operations. Politics and conflict may derail that, and we'll talk more about conflict in a later class. But they too can be managed by good values and also by the principle of the and. If you have questions on this presentation, please send them to me as an email, and I will post those, or you can add them to the discussion section in Canvas. Break as you desire. Roberto's 3x3 reading summaries are in the slide deck. I'm not going to read through those, but he, I think, has provided a very readable set slides, so I'll just leave that to you to look at. I'm going to skip over these though, and if you have to discuss the, let me go up to those. So the top questions that he lists at the end here are ones that you can discuss in the Canvas discussion sessions, and tell Roberto what you think of these particular questions. That's optional, not a requirement. And notice that he has a bonus question on here. Okay, some observations that I'd like to make about the readings. I told you about the sign that we had on the data center wall, the glass wall that faced outside, so everybody in the organization could see that at Save the Children. Also, if you notice in the Phoenix project, Bill and John, when they're meeting with the senior managers, first with with Dick, the CFO, COO, and then with others, is sort of asking the question, well, not only what are your goals and what are your objectives, but what's a good day and what's a bad day? And can you describe those? Because rather than just measuring the uptime of an organization, which we saw in the data center tour and the tier definitions of data centers, it's taking a look at, well, where is pain occurs. So for example, if you have a finance system that goes out at the closing time at the end of the month, or the day or two following the end of the month, where the books are closed and updated for that month, and you have a system outage on that day or that evening when they're working late on it, it's major pain, as opposed to if it happens in the middle of the month for the finance department. So the pain index is an important one to ask. The other thing is that by having these two numbers, the top number is how many consecutive days have we had good days, and the bottom number is what's our record number of consecutive good days that we've had before. People really focus, they work hard to beat that 28 number. So as 20 gets up closer to 26 and 27, people will double check and triple check things because they want to beat that 28-day good days in a row. This was based on some work that was done at Hallmark Cards, and they had defined these good days in terms of pain points, and started counting consecutive good days, which we then reported on this flip chart. And as I said, everybody focused to ensure that we wanted to beat that record, and nobody wanted an outage on their watch, particularly as we got close to that record. When we beat the record, that was really important part of this is, not only would we cheer and whoop it up, but we'd have a celebration. So, free pizza was ordered in, or we'd have a beer blast if it was like a Friday afternoon, and celebrate the fact that we had beat that record. And in beating that record, notice that the quality of the IT operations to the organization has been going up. As the reliability in mode 1 IT has gotten more consecutively occurs, then the value of operational IT has been increasing to the organization. When looking at mapping business metrics to IT needs, this matrix is another interesting thing to do. Looking at performance measures on the left, and then some of the IT, where the reliance is on this. So, notice this has got some things that come right out of the Phoenix project. So you've got, time to market in R&D is number 4, that's Phoenix. And then having 3-year cycles and reducing the work in process. These end up mapping to what Dick is saying as the finance manager in Phoenix. Tying the IT metrics to the business goals is a very key way of aligning IT. So if business goals and IT goals are aligned, then IT is seen as supporting and helping the business to meet their goals. And then it focuses the IT department on delivering the things that do meet those goals, which is what this does. Summary chart I found on the 3 ways. There are multiple things you can find on a Google search on these, but way number 1 on flow is getting things to flow from development into operations. Feedback loops, so is development hearing the feedback from operations? And then experimenting and learning is trying small iterations of things to see where improvements can be made in that larger loop. We got another break plugged in here, so if you want to pause and go and get yourself another sparkling water, please. This exercise that follows is a take-home exercise number 5, so I will leave that to you to do separately. Take a look at the rubric that's linked in the take-home number 5 exercise, due on the 27th. So the Din Tai Fung dumpling process, which we showed on the Blackboard last week, and I was going to post the photo that I took of this, but it was such a mess, and this was such a cleaner diagram that I decided to include the clean diagram instead. There's this making process, from the dough all the way to the steam, and there are some very specific metrics in this. There's no waste in this process, and then there's an eating process as well. That we also recognize that you go through. And the reason why we looked at this example of a dumpling making and eating as a process is it's a way to look outside of the typical organization processes, look at something that's different, and then look at how do I apply what's represented here, apply it back to the organization, back to the IT department. The emphasis here in this process is on quality, not on time, not on cost or flexibility or scope. So making sure that it's the same dumpling first time and every time is key to their process. They do a great job of that within country, particularly in Taiwan and Hong Kong. They don't do a good job of it, though, in other countries, which I found fascinating. They earned a Michelin star in their restaurant in Hong Kong, and that stands for quality, mastery, personality, value, and consistency is how Michelin defines the meaning of that star. So notice the alignment there on quality. Now, the interesting thing is that Din Tai Fung dumpling making is not a good candidate for business process reengineering, which is what BPR is, about how to make a process lean. So this is a lot of what's happening in the Phoenix project in terms of lean management is making and lean processes is how do you make IT function in a more lean fashion. And so they're going through their own version of reengineering their development and operation processes. If you've already got a lean process, which is what Din Tai Fung represents, then you're not going to make an improvement by re-engineering it. Matter of fact, your goal is more, how do I keep the quality going? And how do I get that quality up when comparing country to country? So the deadline book that we've read, we've got this project management novel that we read a chapter from that I spoke about quite a bit earlier. Here are the key characters from here. In this particular chapter, we're dealing with the Webster Tompkins and Gabriel Belinda. They make up the dream team, project team, and then Belloc is the evil counter character in this book. There are other characters that are introduced elsewhere in the book that are sort of in the background in this chapter, but I thought I'd list them here just for completeness. And the recap of the story, is that Tompkins was put in charge of these 6 large projects. The CEO, which they refer to as the NNL, Nation's Noble Leader, has left on some other business. Tompkins is feeling really good about the work that they're accomplishing and the project experiments they're running and what they're learning and how they're changing and making improvements in that. But then when the NNL leaves, he puts Belloc in charge, and Belloc says, well, we need to cut the schedule and make it 186 days, and then we need to combine teams because lateness costs $250,000 per day in profit. So if we get the stuff out earlier, we make profit earlier, and that's what the CFO decides needs to be done over great objections from the IT team. And a good example, and we see this also in the Phoenix project, when Steve doesn't listen to the IT department and operations that Phoenix is going to crash and burn if we release it, and they release it anyway, and it crashes and burns. And so one of the the board of directors, behind the scenes, we don't actually see that scene in the book, read the riot act to Steve, and Eric talks about it, and he realizes the error of his ways. So I'm going to skip over these slides here. Those are part of the exercises, and then the exercise of brainstorming about this and picking the top 3 things from it. QA and discussion, do those online as you wish. Those are optional in Canvas discussions. Team project roles and decisions. You need to make, as part of the take-home exercise, decisions about what roles you're playing on each of your projects. Teams. This is a sample of one of the project teams in crisis informatics last semester or the prior year. This was a team A, and they had defined a head of tech infrastructure, a head of communications, head of logistics, etc. That was, and then the initials above are the individuals who played those roles on the teams. And they, in fact, had 2 teams that worked on this. And then they went through and defined what each role was responsible for, and I believe they used a RACI exercise to do that. When you introduce your team to the senior management team, you're going to need to say what roles you each played on the team. And so having a discussion of those like this, where also credential, in this case, they made up some credentials, some of these are accurate, and the credential statement becomes an important statement up front as to why the senior management team should listen to you for this proposal, other than the fact that they're polite and they want to do this. For next steps, you all have your teams, you have your mentors, you have your scenarios. I know one of the teams, Team 4, has changed their scenario. It's a scenario number 9, and they're defining their own, which is fine. I still would say that the teams that have picked scenario 3, think carefully about do you want to present the same scenario as 2 other groups in front of the senior manager team and invite the comparisons. It's fine if you want to do that, that's okay, but keep in mind that you may have a bit of extra work to do to differentiate yourself. Okay. Challenge scenarios we've seen before. Next steps. The class plan, as you know, is a defining document. I've added some tabs at the class plan, particularly on the sequencing of assignments. These are the readings for next week. The POA number 2 assignment got moved out to a week after the spring break, due March 12th, so it gives a little more breathing space. Next week, I hope the guest speaker will be Eric Arnold. He still needs to get back to me to confirm that. If not next week, he'll be at another week. We'll be taking a mid-course survey next time that will allow some time in class to actually log online and take a survey that Erping Zhu from CRLT has been kind enough to provide, and she will be doing the scoring of those surveys. I won't see names, I'll only see results. And then more importantly, talk about what changes we're going to make as a result. Also, the dean, Tiffany Vinot, will be here as an observer. She was unable to make the class last week, so she will be in the class next week. And Uche has volunteered to summarize the readings, so he's on for next week. And I'm working on POA1 grading and feedback to try to get you those by Monday so that the teams can act on those accordingly before the break. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Enjoy your weekend.